Cross stiffened. He assaulted an officer, he snapped, voice brittle, desperate. That's an arrestable offense. No, he didn't. Sanders' tone left no room for argument. Cross opened his mouth, then shut it. Because deep down, beneath the anger and the shame, he knew there had been no attack, no resistance, only control. A control he had never possessed. And now, standing in the middle of the park, surrounded by cameras, by onlookers, by truth, there was nothing left for him to do. Sanders extended a hand, palm up. Badge and gun. Cross's stomach twisted. His hands hovered at his belt, reluctant, shaking. He could feel every set of eyes on him, the quiet judgment of the crowd, the finality of the moment. He had come here expecting submission. Now he was the one being dismissed. Slowly, painfully, he unpinned his badge, feeling the weight of it in his palm for the first time. Then, with one last breath, he placed it into Sanders' waiting hand. A heartbeat later, his gun followed. It was over. And for the first time, Cross had no power left to take. The weight of the moment pressed down on Cross's chest like a vice. He could hear the faint murmurs rippling through the crowd, the quiet gasps, the scattered whispers, each one confirming the undeniable truth. It was over. Sanders closed his fingers around the badge and gun, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, he didn't need to. Go home, Dan. 2 simple words. 2 words that left no room for argument. Cross clenched his jaw. His entire world had just unraveled before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The authority he had relied on, gone. The power he had wielded over others, stripped away. The fear he had used to control, now turned against him. For a fleeting moment he considered arguing, grasping for something, anything, to reclaim a fraction of what had been lost. But the cold, stark reality had already settled in. No one feared him anymore. The badge hadn't made him powerful. The gun hadn't made him untouchable. People had followed his orders out of obligation, not respect. And now that those symbols of authority were gone, he was just a man who had lost everything without a single punch being thrown. A heavy silence stretched between them, but Sanders didn't move. He wasn't going to drag Cross away like some disgraced criminal. This wasn't about punishment. This was about accountability. And that was a fate far worse. Cross's throat felt tight. His fingers twitched at his sides, still wanting to fight, still wanting to deny. But there was no fight left, no words that could change what had already been seen. So he did the only thing left to do. He turned and walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last, the murmurs behind him like a storm at his back. He kept his head up, refusing to acknowledge the judgment that followed him, but he felt it burn into his skin. By the time he reached the edge of the park, it was as if he no longer existed. Behind him, life moved on. Chuck Norris remained on his bench, untouched, unmoved, feeding his pigeons as if nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had. There had never been a fight, never a contest of strength. Just a lesson about power, about control, about what it truly means to be strong. And as the former officer disappeared into the city, stripped of his authority, his name no longer carrying weight, Chuck simply scattered another handful of seeds. Because for those who understood true power, there was never a need to prove it. Power is not about force, it's about control, discipline, and respect. The downfall of Officer Cross in this story reflects a timeless truth. Those who abuse authority eventually lose it. In real life, we see this unfold in many ways. Leaders who rule with fear eventually fall, while those who lead with wisdom and integrity earn lasting respect. This story serves as a reminder that true strength is quiet. It isn't found in a badge, a title, or a weapon. It's found in character, self-awareness, and the ability to act with purpose rather than impulse. Chuck Norris never needed to prove himself, because his presence alone commanded respect. For anyone in a position of authority, whether in leadership, law enforcement, or everyday life, the lesson is clear. Power should be used responsibly. Respect is earned through actions, not demanded through fear. The moment you need to force it, you've already lost it. And for those facing unfair treatment, Let this be proof that dignity, patience, and confidence can dismantle even the most oppressive forces. True power lies in knowing who you are, without needing to prove it. He thought he was in control, a badge on his chest, a baton in his hand, and an ego too big to question. But in a matter of seconds, everything changed. One mistake, one wrong target, and the officer realized he wasn't the hunter, he was the prey, and the world was watching. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The afternoon sun hung high over Griffith Park, casting golden light through the dense canopy of oak and sycamore trees. A warm breeze rustled the leaves, providing fleeting moments of relief from the California heat. Families lounged on blankets, children darted along the walking paths, and joggers moved in steady rhythms, their footsteps tapping softly against the pavement. Laughter mixed with the distant hum of the city, creating an atmosphere of peace and routine. Among the many visitors, one man sat apart from the crowd. His presence was unassuming, blending seamlessly into the scenery. He occupied a worn wooden bench near a shaded grove, his posture relaxed, one booted foot resting over the other. His hands, rough and calloused from years of use, casually scattered birdseed onto the pavement, where a growing flock of pigeons eagerly pecked at the kernels. He watched them with an almost meditative stillness, his face partially obscured beneath the shadow of a well-worn cowboy hat. He wore faded blue jeans, a simple brown shirt, and a leather belt with a silver buckle dulled from years of wear. A neatly trimmed beard framed his strong, weathered features that spoke of a man who had lived through more than most. Despite his quiet demeanor, there was something in the way he held himself that suggested experience, control, and an understanding of the world that ran far deeper than what the eye could see. Unbothered by the passing crowds, he remained still, content in the simplicity of feeding the birds. There was no urgency in his movements, no need for conversation or distraction. In that moment, he simply existed. That was when the sound of heavy boots crunching against the pavement disrupted the stillness. The deliberate, measured stride cut through the natural ambience of the park, commanding attention whether people wanted to give it or not. The sound grew louder, closer, until the man wearing those boots came into view. Officer Dan Cross was a tall, broad-shouldered figure, his LAPD uniform perfectly pressed, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the world around him. His utility belt was stocked with the tools of law enforcement: baton, handcuffs, taser, and firearm, all polished and positioned with precision. He carried himself with rigid authority, the kind that made people straighten their backs and avert their eyes. As he patrolled the park, his gaze swept over the crowd, assessing each person with quiet judgment. Most he ignored, the joggers, the families, the dog walkers. But when his eyes landed on the man sitting alone on the bench, his steps slowed. Something about him felt off, too still, too unconcerned. Cross's lips curled slightly in disdain. He had seen men like this before, old relics who thought they could do whatever they pleased, who believed they were above the authority that kept society in order. He decided then and there that he would remind this man who was in charge. Veering off the main path, he started toward the bench, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The pigeons fluttered slightly but did not scatter. The man on the bench, still unmoving, remained unaware, or perhaps simply uninterested, in the officer's approach. But as Cross closed the distance, he had no way of knowing that this was a mistake, one that he would soon regret. Cross stopped directly in front of the bench, his shadow falling over the seated man. His stance was wide, feet planted firmly, hands resting on his belt in a posture designed to command attention. The pigeons, unfazed, continued pecking at the scattered seeds. The man remained as he was, his fingers methodically tossing another handful onto the ground, as if he hadn't noticed the officer's looming presence. That wasn't going to fly. Cross cleared his throat, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Park's got rules," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "You've been sitting here a long time. Loitering's not allowed." The man didn't respond. He didn't flinch, didn't look up, just kept feeding the birds. Cross frowned, his irritation growing. He was used to immediate compliance, people reacting the moment he spoke, shifting nervously under his gaze, but this man, it was as if he hadn't even heard him. Cross took a step closer, his polished boot stopping inches from the bench. His fingers flexed at his side, brushing the reassuring presence of his baton. "I'm talking to you," he said, his tone sharper now. "You got some ID on you?" Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the man adjusted the brim of his hat, revealing more of his face. His features were worn but strong, his eyes sharp even in the afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unhurried. "I'm just feeding the birds." Cross felt his patience snap. There was something about the man's tone, too measured, too unaffected. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was something worse, indifference. "Yeah? Well, I'm telling you it's time to move along." The man remained still. Another handful of birdseed slipped through his fingers, landing softly against the pavement. The pigeons barely noticed the tension in the air, but the people nearby did. A woman walking her dog slowed her steps, casting a quick glance toward the scene. A group of young men at a picnic table exchanged knowing looks. Cross exhaled sharply through his nose. Enough of this. In one swift motion he reached down and grabbed the man's shoulder, his grip firm, commanding. It was the last decision he would make on his own. Before he could process what was happening, a hand, calloused, steady, closed around his wrist. It wasn't violent, wasn't aggressive, just controlled, unshakable. The pressure wasn't enough to cause pain, but it sent a message, one that bypassed logic and struck straight at the core of something primal. Cross's chest tightened. His instinct told him to yank his arm free, but before he could, the grip released. He stumbled back a step, his breath suddenly uneven. The man simply dropped another handful of seeds, his expression unreadable. Cross clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering in his ears. Something was very wrong. Cross took a step back, his fingers curling instinctively around the baton at his side. His pulse was steady, but there was something unsettling beneath his skin, a slow, burning frustration that felt dangerously close to uncertainty. This wasn't normal. People responded to authority. That was the way the world worked. He spoke, they listened. He commanded, they obeyed. But this old man wasn't reacting the way he should. No tension, no hesitation, just stillness. Cross squared his shoulders, gripping the baton with more intent this time. He wasn't about to let some weathered stranger make a fool of him. His voice, sharp and clipped, cut through the space between them. "I'm not going to ask again. Move along." No response. The fingers of his free hand twitched at his side. He'd dealt with drunks, punks, protesters, people who thought they had something to prove. This wasn't that. This was something else, something he couldn't quite put a name to, and that made it worse. His grip on the baton tightened. Crack. The wood struck the bench inches from the man's leg. The sharp sound split the air, startling the pigeons into a brief flurry of wings before they settled again. Conversations around them stilled. A few heads turned. Someone muttered under their breath. The man remained where he was. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted the brim of his hat, his face still unreadable beneath the shadow it cast. He didn't flinch, didn't stiffen. His body language didn't shift in the slightest. Cross's stomach twisted, though he refused to acknowledge why. He pointed the baton directly at the man's chest. Last warning? Nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick and weighted. Cross's pride burned hot. He'd given enough chances. He moved fast, raising the baton again, this time to make sure the man got the message. But before it could land, something changed. The old man moved. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't violent. It wasn't even something Cross could fully process in the moment. 1 second his baton was swinging down. The next, it was gone. Gone. Not yanked, not wrestled away. Just taken. Cross blinked, his grip empty, his breath uneven. The man held the baton now, weighing it lightly in his palm. No aggression, no smugness, just quiet assessment. And then, just as deliberately, he let it fall to the ground. The sound of it hitting the pavement was softer than Cross expected, but it landed harder than anything he had ever felt. The baton rested on the ground between them, an inanimate object that had, moments ago, symbolized control. Now, it was nothing. Cross stared at it, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that the old man had disarmed him so effortlessly, or the way he had discarded the baton as if it had never mattered. Around them, the hum of the park had shifted. It wasn't silent, but there was a different energy now, a quiet, growing awareness. The onlookers weren't just passing glances anymore. They were watching. Cross clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let this escalate further. He wasn't going to let some old man humiliate him in front of a crowd. His authority was not up for debate. His fingers twitched toward his holster. The weight of his firearm was familiar, solid, the last word in any confrontation. But before his hand could close around the grip, something made him pause. Not hesitation. Something deeper. The old man was watching him now. Not with defiance, not with challenge, just patience. A slow, measured kind of patience, the kind that came from experience, from knowing exactly how something would play out before it even began. A flicker of doubt curled in Cross's stomach, uninvited and unwelcome. His grip on the holster tightened. He had drawn his gun 100 times before. In standoffs, in high-risk calls, in situations where control needed to be established. This should have been no different. But it was, because the man in front of him had yet to react with fear. Cross had seen all types. He knew what resistance looked like. Anger, aggression, panic. He knew what defiance looked like. Raised voices, squared shoulders, fists clenched in misguided rebellion. This was neither. This was something much worse. A man who wasn't afraid. A man who didn't see him as a threat. Cross's throat went dry. But pride was a dangerous thing. His fingers curled tighter around the grip, his body tense with the need to regain control. If this old man thought he could just ignore authority, he had another thing coming. Then, in a single fluid motion, he drew the weapon. And that was the exact moment everything changed. Because before he could even lift it fully, before he could aim, before he could think, his wrist was caught in an iron grip. Not harsh, not forceful, just controlled. And just like the baton before it, the gun was no longer his. Cross barely registered the moment it left his grasp. 1 second it was in his hand, the next it was gone. And he never even saw it happen. Cross's fingers twitched uselessly in mid-air, still curled around a weapon that was no longer there. His breath hitched. His mind scrambled to catch up with reality. It wasn't just the speed, it was the precision, the ease. The old man hadn't struggled, hadn't wrestled, hadn't needed to. He had simply taken. And now that same weapon, the badge of authority Cross had relied on for years, rested in calloused hands that turned it over once, as if weighing it, considering its worth. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the park. Chuck Norris didn't look at Cross. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. This was the closest to a joke Matthew had ever got, and suddenly, it felt like home. He simply bent down and placed the gun on the pavement beside the discarded baton, then straightened with a slow, deliberate ease. No words, no challenge, just an action that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Cross's chest burned, his pride screaming for retaliation. He had been stripped of everything. His baton, his gun, his presence. But he wasn't done. He wouldn't, couldn't let this stand. Then he saw it. A glint of black, a phone raised. No, not just one. Several. The realization slammed into him harder than any physical blow. The moment wasn't just happening, it was being captured. His stomach lurched, his mind reeled. This wasn't just humiliation. This was evidence. His career, his authority, his entire image hung by a thread. He had to regain control. Desperation surged through him, overriding the fear curling at the edges of his mind. His body moved before his brain could catch up, lunging forward in one final, reckless attempt to seize back power. It was a mistake. Chuck had already seen it coming. Cross barely had time to register the shift in weight before he was moving again, not forward but down. He didn't know how, he didn't even know what had happened. One moment he was lunging, the next the world had tilted. His feet left the ground, his body turned in a way he didn't understand, guided by a force too smooth to be brute strength. And then impact. Not hard, not violent. Just final. He lay flat on his back, staring at the sky, his chest rising and falling in shallow, stunned breaths. The murmurs in the crowd had shifted. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were laughter. Not mocking, not cruel. Just the sound of people witnessing something inevitable. And then, cutting through it all, a voice. Calm, measured, absolute. Enough. The senior officer had arrived. And from the weight of his tone, Cross already knew. It was over. Cross's breath came in short, uneven bursts. He could still feel the heat of the pavement beneath him, the dull ache in his limbs from how effortlessly he had been put there. But it wasn't the fall that made his hands clench into fists. It was the silence. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed that single word. Enough. The voice cut through the murmurs, the laughter, the hushed disbelief of the crowd. It wasn't a yell, it wasn't a barked command, but it carried a weight that made everything around them still. Cross didn't need to look to know who it belonged to. Lieutenant Eric Sanders. A veteran officer, respected, unshakable. A man who had worn the badge long enough to recognize when someone had gone too far. And now he was here. Cross forced himself to his feet, his uniform rumpled, his pride in shambles. His gaze flicked toward the senior officer, searching for any sign of support, any opening to twist the situation in his favor. But Sanders wasn't looking at him. His sharp, knowing eyes were locked onto Chuck Norris. And then, recognition. It was subtle. A shift in posture, a flicker in his expression. But Cross saw it. Sanders knew who the old man was. The realization struck like a sledgehammer. The lieutenant didn't reach for his cuffs, didn't reach for his radio, didn't move to assert authority. Instead, he let out a slow, measured breath and spoke again, this time to Cross. Walk away. The words landed like a punch to the gut.